the whole media is blowing up over it, right? They're getting really angry because anytime they see any sentiment that is positive towards white people, where white people aren't ashamed of who we are or what have you, it has to be demonized as some kind of evil agenda. It has to be demonized as some kind of negative intention, or even if we say, hey, we love everybody, we don't want to hurt anybody, we're just living in this intentional community, or doing this project, they treat it as if there's some nefarious intention.
Good afternoon and welcome to Beholden To Truth. It is your humble host Joshua here with you for a very special episode. I know you guys love it when I do interviews on the show, and honestly, it's a lot of work for me, okay? Before this interview, I was over here fumbling with the technology like an old man, so I hope you guys appreciate my suffering. But this is the second time that I have had our star guest on the show, Pinesap. And I was actually watching the first time that he was on the show earlier this morning. We had a collaboration back in January, and I had forgotten this, but through watching that reminder, I just slipped in a comment like, so man, you're the second guest I've ever had on my show. I was like, wow, I had forgotten that bit of trivia. So this guy goes way back with me in the platform, and he goes back even further than I do in terms of being engaged with America First. So I feel very privileged to have him on the platform, to have already had him on as long ago as I did, and especially given some of the recent events in his life. I think it's pretty awesome that we get to catch up now here a little less than a year later. And I think you guys are probably going to enjoy hearing his side of what has happened recently with his public appearances. So without further ado, Pinesap, go ahead and introduce yourself to those who don't know you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pinesap. You probably seen me around before. I'm a Catholic apologist online, and I'm associated with the America First movement, headed by NJF. Not in any Nicholas J. Fuentes, not in any official capacity, but I'm a huge supporter, and I love to kind of bring that Catholic element to the movement, talking about theology, talking about kind of Catholic politics, and what have you. And so, really, that's sort of my background.
Yeah, like one of the things I can just jump right in, like ignore my complete agenda that I have and just jump onto things that you say. But you did mention that it's not necessarily a formal thing like America First, as if it's some organization. Now, it is true that Nick does run a nonprofit, the America First Foundation, to help him do what he's doing. But America First is a political movement. It is decentralized. It's not a membership group. You don't have to sign anything to join it. And that's something that came up actually as an important thing to delineate, because Nick recently did a collaboration with Arvel. And Pinesap, you're aware of Arvel and the work that he's doing?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so for those who aren't, you should watch my episode where I broke down the Nick and Arvel interview that came out last week. But Arvel Orwell is a white guy who lives in Arkansas, who has a group called, or an organization called Return to the Land. And its mission statement is to create all white communities throughout the United States. They started in the Ozarks, they're working on building one in Missouri and a couple of other places. And starting out small, I think they're one there in Arkansas is like 40-ish members currently, but they're doing things from a unique land buy where the individuals living there don't have to buy the property from the larger organization that owns the whole land trust. And this is for legal reasons, because you can't legally discriminate selling a home based on race. So they're basically testing the waters legally to see if this can withstand the inevitable lawfare that many people are going to wage against them simply for wanting to practice their right of freedom of association and self-segregate, focus on building white neighborhoods. And they're trying to figure out how they can do so legally. And someone's actually doing it now. It's not like it's being theorized about. But when Nick had this conversation with Arvel, that concept of decentralized, informal organization versus highly organized, hierarchical, necessarily pursuit of this pro-white agenda. And Arvel has to do it in a hierarchy because they're collectivizing resources. Somebody has to be delegating how those resources are distributed. people have to make decisions about the land and about who is going to occupy what roles in that land. And so that's obviously a much more formal method of trying to create safe spaces for whites and advocate for us. Whereas Nick's method is highly decentralized, and he even says, because our mission is more political rather than physical communities, it's more advantageous for us to be decentralized. That way we can't be sued into oblivion, and they can't destroy our movement by coming after the vice president of it or trying to do some kind of reputational assassination of the leader of it. So just wanted to toss that out there and see if you got a chance to watch that collaboration with Nick and Arvel, or if you had any just commentary to add about that whole body of work of Return to the Land.
Yeah, I haven't seen the full interview yet. Things have been kind of a little busy right now, and so I haven't had kind of a allotted section of time to sit down and really review it. But the few clips that I have seen is that it's very sad because Arvel is making a community where nobody's being heard, nobody's being forced off their land, nobody's being put in a position of really sort of discrimination. I would say it's just free association, and it's like-minded sort of white people wanting to live together in this intentional community, and the whole media is blowing up over it. Right? They're getting really angry because anytime they see any sentiment that is positive towards white people, where white people aren't ashamed of who we are or what have you, it has to be demonized as some kind of evil agenda. It has to be demonized as some kind of negative intention. Or even if we say, hey, we love everybody, we don't want to hurt anybody, we're just living in this intentional community or doing this project, they treat it as if there's some nefarious intention behind the scenes. You know what I mean? They treat it as if you're saying, oh, well, this is what I want to present as being the case. But then, you open my closet and there's, like, I don't know, Aryan nations, flags, and all that kind of stuff, hanging down. And it's like, no, I wouldn't say, I mean, those people don't really exist that much anymore.
Mm.
And on top of that, I think it's very jarring for the media because to see a group of white people that don't have any negative intention, they don't have any hate in their heart, they're not going out there and being like neo Nazis or anything like that, something horrible like that, but they're just living in this community where they can raise their children and have sort of this sort of beautiful experience like Orania in South Africa. They don't know what to do with themselves because it's not so easily demonized. It's not so easily able to fit into a perfect media story where they can point at these people and say, those are the bad guys, go get them. I think a lot of people might even look at it and say, well, what's the issue here? Like, they're not hurting anybody. They live on private land. They're just, living in, again, this intentional community, similar to if a religious community banded together, or even there's many other communities of different races that kind of live in these intentional communities. I remember there was even, I think, a proposition for a black one
Mm-hmm.
in Colorado somewhere, and nobody batted an eye at that. But the moment that white people do something like that, it's treated as an evil act. And so I think we really see a full display of anti-white racism going on, where a lot of normal people are just scratching their heads and saying, "What's the issue here?" These people aren't, again, neo Nazis. They're not Aryan Nation. They're not any sort of like nefarious or evil group. They're just like normal people who want to live in this intentional community, and you're out here demonizing them. What's going on? So I hope, my hope is that if the media tries to portray them negatively, this can open up a conversation about racism towards white people and hopefully get a lot more people kind of on our side, realizing like we don't want to hurt anybody or do anything negative to any other group. We just like being who we are.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with the danger of it and why they're having to try to swarm it, largely unsuccessful because there's just not that much evil to point to. They're not running around spouting racial slurs or waving Nazi flags or burning crosses or any of this other
No.
American History X nonsense propaganda, because traditionally that's what they have been able to characterize whites who actually advocate for themselves as. They've been able to point to the swastika or whatever symbol of racial bigotry. to say like this is how anybody who is white who says that they prefer European culture, they prefer majority white places, this is what they're secretly thinking. If you got to look into their neighborhoods and behind their front doors, this is how they would be acting and how they'd be speaking. And then you send NBC News into Return to the Land and they're following them around and they're like churning butter. It's like basically an Amish community, just without the religiosity. So I think it is hopefully going to be a moment for the larger population to get a true, authentic sense of my personal mission, which has always been to humanize those who have been demonized on this racial subject. The idea that you feel closer to your own extended kin, people who look like you, speak like you, who genuinely appreciate your ancestors and don't continually denigrate them, who celebrate the same traditions and care about even the other nations that you used to come from. Those things are important. They're not trivial, and everybody else practices this unapologetically, whether it's Jews or whether it's Arab people. They're very much attached to their various Middle Eastern countries. So are South Americans and Central Americans. This is practiced all over the world, including Asia. Like there isn't a single racial or ethnic group that just simply doesn't care whatsoever about their ancestors and all of the peripheral cultural aspects of that ethnicity. And so I think the historical method of what's the opposite of glamorizing, demonizing any white person who so dares to go out and say, I don't think there's anything wrong with white people saying that they prefer to live amongst white people. And why am I even having to think about apologizing for that? Nobody else apologizes for feeling more attracted towards people of their co-race or wanting to protect the reputation of the ancestors or the cultures that they built. All of the various civil institutions that are unique to those various groups, that people around the world do things differently. And there is a bit of self-awareness to white people that says the reason European countries are objectively so successful, and you can measure that through global immigration patterns. All of the non-white world, they're not flooding into Africa to go live, or Asia, or the Middle East, or Central or South America. They're flooding into Europe. The non-white people are all the other races come to the various European civilizations because they're so attractive. You look at things like safety, poverty, believing that you'll have a fair trial in our judicial system, believing that you'll be invested in when you get here, access to education, it just goes on and on and on. These things that non-white people living in white civilizations have taken for granted. They just think that they're like baked into living in the modern world. But guess what? Modernity is a worldwide thing. Like modernity isn't limited to where you currently live. If you look at the modern world in all of these other places, doesn't look like Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, especially before the immigration waves. So to bring some humanization to white advocates, I think is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And to even be able to speak openly about these topics now, we're living in very different times than when we last sat down only 8 months ago.
We really are. Well, and the fact is that a lot more people are becoming right wing, conservative, Catholic, adopting Christianity, becoming, I think, a lot more racially conscious too. And there's a kind of paradigm shift amongst the younger generations to kind of all these worldviews and things that even when we last spoke weren't as popular as they are now, because I think everyone is seeing it's really kind of funny. The center and liberalism is sort of eroding.
Mhm.
And I don't mean liberalism as a pejorative. I mean sort of the traditional, you could almost say like 90s liberalism of America, Seinfeld and that culture that a lot of, I think, Gen X grew up in and millennials kind of tasted the tail end of. Now people, whether right wing or left wing, are kind of entrenching themselves a lot more in the thought of their particular side. And what we're seeing is for people who are considering sort of a general right wing ethos, they're moving a lot further to the right. They're adopting, again, more of these ideas. Even the Trump presidency, for as much as it has kind of cucked out on a lot of the things we care about, um, really adopted sort of language that even like 4 years ago would have seemed unimaginable, right? And I think a lot of that's pandering, but you have to ask, why are they seeking to pander, right? Why is Stephen Miller trying to appeal to sort of a nativist sentiment, right? Or why is Trump talking about kind of these ideas of American culture being more than just, the Constitution and, knowing how to read the Bill of Rights? I mean, you've got the Department of Homeland Security, I'm pretty sure, just on X the other day posted that Manifest Destiny image. It's a very iconic image. And, everyone's freaking out and losing their minds over it. But there's something significant about that, even when it is pandering. It's that these people understand the younger generations are adopting a truly right wing worldview. And since we last talked, I've only seen that accelerate.
Meeting the people that you actually want to meet this day and age is basically impossible. Well, I have a solution to these problems. You're wearing your anti-Zog merchandise, that cutie from across the gym. She knows what the Zog is. She knows that Save Europa is code for white genocide. Or if it's somebody of the same gender, boom, you just got yourself a new best friend. This is your opportunity. Everybody's always complaining about how hard it is to find people who know what's really going on. Well, this is it. This is how you broadcast those beliefs to the world. Yeah, a couple of, they seem silly examples, but when commercials, mainstream commercials of American corporations start unapologetically, overtly pandering to white people, you're living in a completely different time. And there's two examples that came across my timeline just like in the last 48 hours. One of them going super viral was the American Eagle jeans commercial. I forget the girl's name, something Sweeney, but she's talking about
Sydney Sweeney.
Yeah, how genes are passed down. It's a play on words. We all get it, but she's obviously talking about the thin, white, European woman, beautiful, and how those looks are passed down through your biology, right? We know it's not really talking about genes. Like there's a wink, wink, nod, nod, because previously American Eagle, Gap, all these various apparel companies in the age of Biden and Kamala Harris and all the wokeism, DEI madness, those commercials were flooded with body diversity models and minority models and basically everything other than classic American, good looking, in shape, white men and women, right? And so for a company as large and influential, especially to the young demographic, to go out and say, thin white is beautiful and it's actually something that's tied to your biology, you inherit it, that's pretty bold, and it may be pandering, and I'm not sure how long it's going to stay, but I love to see it. And then even Dunkin' Donuts had an ad that was racially playing a game, basically. I don't know how else to explain it, but to see those things on mainstream television, and as you mentioned, even our political actors having to make these concessions because they feel the pressure of the base, the actual real base of conservatism in America, knowing that they're the future generation who are going to start occupying those roles, whether it's in the C-suites or in think tanks or in formal government at every level, city, county, state, and federal level. They have to try to get their influence into them as soon as possible. And I'm sure they're going to try to grab them through this pandering, but then shape their minds and try to pull them back to America's a melting pot, diversity is our strength, all of that stuff. But with how radicalized this generation is, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the pandering is going to be unsuccessful, and they're intelligent enough to know that you're giving us red meat because that's what we want to hear. But we're not changing our opinion. When you allow us to actually occupy those governmental roles, we're sticking to our guns. We're not going to reopen the border, and we're not going to encourage even legal immigration. And this is something very important when you look at what we talked about earlier, what Arvil is doing, trying to build intentional communities that have a racial identity. We're going to support those things. When we're in government, we're not going to be the ones trying to attack them legally. We're going to be the ones saying, yeah, that's a good idea. I support that. And it's universally applied. The one you mentioned earlier, I don't know if there was one in Colorado, but I know for sure there was a Black African community in Freedom, Georgia, who did the exact same thing. They wanted to build a community by blacks for blacks. And of course, it was widely celebrated. CNN, NBC, everybody went bananas. They love this idea. But that hypocrisy is nothing new. But what I'm pointing out is that as this younger generation accumulates influence professionally and governmentally, the dynamic is going to get inverted to where previously it was all legal attacks, making sure we couldn't self-segregate. I think soon you're going to see a wave of people trying to figure out how to make this kind of promoted by the powerful people in our country. How soon is anybody's guess, but that's how people feel. That's how our people feel. And our people are accumulating success in every nook and corny, nook and cranny. That's the word I was trying to think of. Every corner, every nook and cranny of this country. Groypers have infiltrated everywhere. We're everywhere. And so I think once we get our hands on the resources that we need, things are going to be changing even faster than they're currently changing, which is very fast.
I would agree with that. And, I would caution people to not get too excited yet or jump the gun with the American Eagle stuff or the Dunkin' Donuts, because to jump the gun too fast would be falling for marketing, right? And we've kind of seen this before. We know that the technocrats, right, really love Trump right now, and so they're willing to, kind of rail against the woke stuff because that's the current regime in power. But who's to say that during the next presidency or the next regime in America, they're going to go right back to where they were or even worse? What is significant though, and what I do see is that when you talk to Gen Z, when you see these like man on the street interviews or what have you, even if they don't have a fully thought out worldview yet, they are a lot more sympathetic and even embracing of these ideas that years ago would have seemed unimaginable to any younger generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where suddenly they're a lot more proud to be who they are. They're a lot more proud of their race. They're a lot more proud of their faith. They are unapologetic in sort of opposing this worldview that was hoisted upon us through the school system and media advertising. And it's a beautiful thing to see. I think it's become kind of cool in a certain sense, because in the past, and I always say it this way, I wish we still had a Christian culture that people could rebel against, because it would mean that we were still in power and we were still winning, or we were still kind of in control of everything. But you see like guys like Sam Smith or any of these modern artists, use like demonic imagery or anti-white imagery on stage, and they're pretending like we're living in Ronald Reagan's America. And we haven't lived in Ronald Reagan's America in a very, very, very long time. And so it comes off as kind of corny, because when you have like, I don't know, Doja Cat using like kind of satanic imagery in her work, it I'm over here thinking to myself, it's like, what culture are you rebelling against? This isn't really the early 90s. This isn't the late 80s anymore. This is, it's not morning in America, it's pitch black. And so for you to use this imagery, for you to kind of like try and rebel against this culture where you're the culture tastemaker, right? You're the person who defines culture at this point. It comes off as very out of touch, and you said the term earlier, corny, right? Whereas to be a young person and to be intentionally conservative, to be intentionally right wing and racially conscious, that is something that is actually punk rock. That is something that is underground. That is something that is not of the mainstream. And I think kids are really drawn to that, because they say, well, what are these ideas? What are these concepts that I've never heard of before? And when they start to explore them, even if it's through Instagram Reels or TikToks, just in the little forums, they start to form a worldview that is fundamentally different than those older generations that have been in control for so long.
It's an interesting generational cycle. The nature of being transgressive is subjective based on the time that you're living in. Like you said, it was transgressive 30 years ago to go and talk about aborting your child and all of these other super duper leftist arguments in terms of the gender relations and sexuality and all of this stuff. yeah, as I said, 30 years ago, it may have been really transgressive and trendy, and that would have got you a record deal to do these things. You know, Ozzy Osbourne biting the head off of a bat on stage at a music concert. But now people just like openly practice Satanism all the time in their music videos and on the concert stage. It's in all the Netflix movies. So it's losing its appeal to the young people because young people have that kind of natural instinct to test the waters. And if the waters are already rotten, like they want to do something that isn't rotten. They're trying to find something that is different. And I don't know. It's I don't know if we got to be born in the right generation in terms of like what side it's better. Like maybe it'd be better to be growing up in a time where you're living in good, healthy spiritual waters and the people who are transgressing are still the minority, or if it's more enriching and fulfilling for us to be born in this timeline where we get to see the progress going back to that and we get to see a revival of the church. You know, it's I don't know that one is better than the other. This is just the human experience. It kind of just depends on when God decides to sprout you up, right?
Well, and Frodo and Gandalf, I remember in Lord of the Rings, have this interaction where Frodo's lamenting how he's born in this time where he has to destroy the ring, right? The ring of power. And he says, I wish I never, had the ring. I wish this never fell into my lap. If I could only go back to the Shire and relax for the rest of my life, that would be most ideal. And Gandalf looks at him and he says, so do many others, right? But we don't choose the time we're born in. We just have to step up to the occasion. I all the time, and I actually was thinking, I was in the shower the other day and I was thinking about making a video related to nostalgia for this very reason. If you go on social media right now amongst the Zoomer crowd and you see like the reels that are especially appealing to early 2000s nostalgia, it's not that people yearn for that time so much just because they want to play with pogs and slammers. They want to, play on GameCube or, ride their Razor scooter to their friend's house. It's that they yearn for a time of greater peace, greater stability, greater hope, a time where, even though things like the Iraq war and some, the inevitable financial collapse that happened in 2008 was kind of right on the horizon, there seemingly was not this polarization. There wasn't this contention. I feel like that was the last time where people could say what an American was. And even amongst the left, there was a general agreement of what it meant to be an American. But now that we are out of that time, I think implicitly many Zoomers feel that they wish to return to a time where it was more peaceful, where it wasn't so polarized. Yet we were put in this time by God for a reason. We were put in this time to transform it, I think, into a better era than even what we saw before. And nostalgia makes us feel comfortable on those rainy days. But when we let it become this kind of cultural poison where we're constantly yearning for a past that no longer exists and we're unable to build a future for ourselves and our children, I think at that point, it does more harm than good. And so it's very easy to look upon the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s and say, man, I wish I lived in that time. Wouldn't that be so great? Wouldn't that be better? And no one would fault you for saying that. But we were put in this time by God to fight for truth and fight for justice and fight for our people and fight for the faith. And that's why we need to embrace the struggle so that we can create an even better future than the past that we look upon.
Yeah, I saw a viral reel about a Blockbuster. Like somebody dug up a VHS tape of just your completely average trip to Blockbuster in 2001 or something like that. And it's just candid camera, looking at people in the aisles, the checkout aisle, getting their M&Ms and looking at Ace Ventura on the wall or whatever else. And it is just so nostalgic. It's one of my favorite words. Um, but it is like you mentioned, kind of an innocence that we all had back then. That some certain world events hadn't even yet happened yet. That would perhaps aware us all to the true nature of humans, and that war has always been a part of our civilizations, and it's not going anywhere. Same with corruption; the two are inextricable, really. Um, And so maybe this is just us turning into older men who are looking back on our younger selves and saying, like, maybe we were just naive. Part of that is technology too, though. The innocence that we had been blessed with, and the same for every generation before us. We weren't consuming on a 24-hour basis all of the world's problems nonstop on our feeds, right? It was whatever awareness you had to human suffering was basically limited to the human suffering within a 20-mile radius of you, maybe a 50-mile radius. But as you get into the technological age, as you get into the TV age, the digital age, the internet age, social media age, this unfortunate, it's like transparency is good. You do want to know when bad things are happening, especially when human suffering unnecessarily is happening. But we were never built to absorb that much information and to have eyes on that much human suffering. It's like having the curtain lifted for us all to actually see the evil worldwide, not just in our local politics or even the stuff that happens behind the scenes with the three-letter agencies in our own countries. To know what is going on now, that innocence is just completely shattered. And you could say that's for the best because, as Christians, we believe that the truth sets all people free. And the truth is not a localized thing. Like if there is a genocide happening 5,000 miles away, as a Christian, we are on the side of the people being genocided. It's that simple. No matter what race they are, no matter what faith they are, we don't want those things to be involving us, especially, right? We don't want to have any blood on our hands. We will do anything we can realistically to try to not allow those things to continue. And so you talk like the Iraq war and stuff like that. When social media wasn't a thing, then we didn't necessarily have full coverage that in terms of what was happening on the ground in corners all across the globe. But the internet and the ability to do your own independent research and independent journalism, people being able to go to these places and without having to go through intermediaries like CNN and so on, now we have so much more information that it's pretty painful. But at the same time, we actually have a better grasp on the real world, for the first time. Like we actually get to know how rotten these governments, not just America, worldwide are. Like obviously the one that's an elephant in the room right now is the whole Epstein situation, where even people who were Trump loyalists, who gave him the benefit of the doubt when he unfortunately didn't deliver on many campaign promises, whether it was Doge is going to save us trillions, I'm going to eliminate the federal income tax, I'm going to end the Ukraine war on day one, I'm going to have mass deportations, I'm going to release the Epstein files. Like, just go down the list of all the promises made to get everybody to buy in again, and then none of those things coming to fruition. But then the abject mishandling of the Epstein files after it was an explicit promise that he was going to get to the bottom of this, that is something that I think even the boomer demographic are watching and saying, like, my son, my nephew, and so on, who are conspiracy theorists who say the government is run by satanic pedophiles and all that other stuff. Maybe I should listen to them, like maybe they're not just like on the internet too far or too long, because clearly there's a lot of Satanism and pedophilia and child sex trafficking happening by our government. And it's also touching all of the other industries in the country as well. It's not just the government, and the fact that it's a global thing too. It's tied to Israel and the Mossad, and the other agencies throughout the world are likely being blackmailed or complicit in the operation for their own desires. It's like this level of disclosure. I don't think people were ready to absorb this much reality in a single human lifetime. I think it's not a close comparison, but the only other time, like the timeline of humanity, where the truth is revealed to everybody would be like Jesus coming back on a global level, right? Like when else in history was these kind of truths being exposed at a global level simultaneously, instantaneously? When other time could that have happened other than Jesus coming back?
You bring up an incredible point there where
the few brave men who have actually tried to go out and do something about white genocide or talk about Jewish influence, the Zionist occupied government, we all know that they get crucified, their careers get destroyed, and so we need to find ways to support each other. One of the ways that I have done that is by creating my Substack, where there are exclusive early access to documentaries, my weekly vlogs, there are ebooks there. There's even an opportunity to set up a one-on-one 30-minute Ask Me Anything if you'd like. All of the proceeds from my Substack, from my YouTube channel, from the merch gets reinvested in the platform. I use that to pay my employees. I use that to buy the equipment that I need, the cameras, the lights, the MacBook, all the books, all of the software, pay for marketing, everything else, but also it protects my literal life. So if you want to help out, please do head on to Substack, get yourself a subscription. Thank you. I appreciate it. America first and Christ is King.